Today I'm going to show you how to start a toe-up sock using Judy's Magic Cast-On method, which is used in the Sock Knitting Bible for the basic sock recipe for the toe-up sock. Now, when you knit socks, you can either knit from the cuff towards the toe, and these are called cuff down socks, and this sock is a cuff down sock. So it started at the rib and then the leg was knitted, then the heel, and then the gusset was shaped, so you can see that lovely straight line where the decreasing has taken place. Then the foot has been knitted, and then finally the toe has been shaped. And what happens is, when you get to the end of the toe, you end up with live stitches on your needles, and you graft those together in a special way which is called Kitchener stitch, and it mimics an actual line of knitting and grafts the toe together so that there isn't a hard seam, so it looks seamless. And what we do with the toe up sock is we mimic that by using Judy's Magic Cast-On method, which was invented or created by Judy Becker. And it's a very popular way to start a pair of toe-up socks. So there's a full tutorial in the Sock Knitting Bible in both illustrated form with drawings and also with step photography. And so I'm going to show you how we start this toe-up sock, and the stitches automatically close together, so there is no gap that needs to be sewn. Okay, and I'm going to use a long circular needle because that's the best and probably the most easiest way to start, and also you're more likely to probably have a long circular needle than the other option, which is these set of flexible trio needles, which I will show you how to use them. These are actually my favourite, but the reason that I'm using a long circular needle is that this is definitely a cheaper option, because you can usually buy these long circular needles for anything from probably about £1.79 up to whatever you want to pay, really, depending on the material of the needles themselves. So in comparison, these flexible trio needles are about £14. So you might not want to invest in those until you are sure that you enjoy the toe-up sock and you want to, make that investment. So I'm going to use the long circular needle first. So if you take your yarn and make a slip knot about 30 centimetres along from the tail end. You don't need a huge amount of the tail end of yarn for this method. So make a slip knot just like you would normally make, and place it onto one of the needle tips, and then just tighten it up slightly. Now you want to take the other needle tip of your long circular needles and just place it next to the needle with the slip knot on, and make sure that your slip knot is on the back needle, or if you're holding them above each other, then it's like the bottom needle, okay, but not on the front needle. That needs to be left free. And then what you're going to do is you're going to get your two tail end of yarns that are coming from that slip knot, and you're going to put your finger, your first finger and your thumb in between those two strands of yarn, and make sure that the tail end of yarn is at the back and the yarn from the ball is at the front. So put your finger, your first finger and your thumb in between the two strands of yarn, grab the strands of yarn with the rest of your hand, and then just open out the strands of yarn with your thumb and your first finger. Okay, so now we've got a front needle that's empty and a back needle that has the slip knot on. We've got the yarn from the ball over our thumb, which is at the front, and the tail end of yarn is over our first finger, which is at the back. And this slip knot counts as your first stitch. Okay, so we're going to have to now make our next stitch with the front needle. So we're going to take these 2 needles, flick them to the back and under that strand of yarn that's over your finger, so that it wraps it around the needle and the yarn goes between the 2 needles. So we take the front needle to the back finger and wrap the yarn over. Can you see what I'm doing there? So front needle to the back, wrap the yarn around so that the yarn is coming out from between the center of the 2 needles. Okay, so now we have a stitch on each needle. So now we're going to bring those 2 needles to the front, and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to take the needles under that strand of yarn and make sure that it then goes round the needle and then in between the needles. So now we have another stitch on the back needle. Then we just repeat that over and over again. Take the front needle to the back and wrap the yarn around it and between the needles. Bring the needles to the front, take the needles under the yarn and wrap it around the back needle. So it goes front to back, wrap it around, back to front and wrap it around, front to back and wrap, back to front and wrap. So it's like a seesaw motion, almost like a figure of 8. And the way that you're wrapping the yarn around the needle closes the stitches together, so there is no gap between the needles and between the stitches. So we'll do all that again. So we're going front needle to the back, wrap the yarn around, back needle to the front and wrap the yarn around, front to back and wrap, back to front and wrap, front to back and wrap, back to front and wrap. So every time you wrap the yarn around, it should be situated in between the needles. Can you see? And that yarn is crossing over, and that's how the stitches are becoming closed. So if we just count how many we've got 2, 4, 6, 8 on the back, 2, 4, 6, 7 on the front. So we'll put one more on the front needle. So we've got 8 on each needle. Now you don't have to do these overly tight, because remember you've got to knit into these on the first round. So if they're really tight, which mine are at the moment, I think I've pulled them too tight, but again, if you leave them too loose, then equally you'll have loose stitches. So probably might need to practice a couple of times before you get the technique completely to your liking. So we're going to put the back needle to the front and under, the front needle to the back and put the yarn around, back needle to the front, wrap the yarn around, front needle to the back, wrap the yarn around. We need to have about 10 or 12. The pattern tells you how many stitches you need to have on each needle for the size of sock that you're knitting. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. I'm going to do another 2 stitches on each needle to get to 12. So back to front, wrap the yarn around, front to back, wrap the yarn around, back needle to the front, front needle to the back. Oops, you see, if you don't go round, it just sits on top of your needle, so you should be able to visually see if you've not wrapped the yarn properly around the needle. So now we should have 12 stitches on each needle. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. So now we've got our required stitches. Because I'm knitting a 64 stitch sock, I need to have 12 stitches on each needle. Now if you let go of the yarn, nothing should happen. They shouldn't fall off your stitches. And then what you're going to do is to rotate the stitches so that they're pointing towards the right. I'm right-handed, so if you were left-handed they would be pointing towards the left. And the yarn is at the back of your stitches ready to start using it. So we have 12 stitches on each needle. The needles are quite tightly held together, so you can let go of them and the stitches won't fall off. So the next step now is to start knitting these needles, and the reason that we use this long circular knitting needle is that we need the length of this cable to be able to pull out the needle tips from these stitches and then use the needle tip to start knitting, and I'll show you how that works next. So now we're going to start knitting. Our yarn, because we held the yarn in the correct place, we had the yarn from the ball over our thumb. So if you try and remember to do that when you use this method of casting on, it means that the yarn is then in the right place when you've finished casting on your stitches. If you forget and you've put the yarn from the ball over your finger and the tail end of yarn over your thumb, don't worry, you can just twist the two strands of yarn around each other so that they don't come undone. So you wouldn't have to necessarily unpick everything and start again. You can just give the yarns a little twist before you start this next step. But because we did it with the yarn from the ball over our thumb, we're in the right place ready to start knitting. Now if you just have a little look at the back of these stitches, you will see that there is a little ridge of knitted stitches, well, what looks like knitted stitches, almost like the reverse of stocking stitch, and that is the wrong side of your knitting, which is going to end up on the inside of your sock. And on the right side you can see we don't have that, we just have the stitches all nice and smooth. So this is going to be the outside of our sock, or the right side of our knitting. So we're going to get the yarn from the ball ready here, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pull the bottom needle out of those stitches, and this is where the cable comes in. We're not going to pull the cable all the way through, we're just going to pull it enough so that we can maneuver this needle and so that we can knit with it, and that's why we need the long circular needles to do this sort of knitting. And what we're going to do is we're going to just start knitting now as you normally would, and just start knitting off the stitches like you normally would with any kind of regular knitting. And can you see the stitches are connected together? And that's why it's called the magic loop, because it is like magic really. I often wonder how creative people invented these sorts of things. It's amazing, isn't it? And then we're all so grateful, and we all have beautiful knitted socks. So you're going to knit all those stitches off, okay, and then when you've finished knitting the top stitches, you're going to turn your work the other way. You're going to push the cable back and push the needle back onto those stitches. It can be a little bit tight on the first round because we've only knitted half of the round so far. We're going to knit the other half, so we pull out the needle again from the bottom long enough so that we can start knitting with it, and then we knit those second set of stitches. And when you knit that first stitch of the second half, always pull it really tight. You want to connect the wire that stitch is being on to the knitting needle as best you can, so that you don't get gaps in your stitches at the ends of the needle. And then you're just going to knit all of those stitches off. I always pull the first couple of stitches quite tight, to be honest, and then hopefully if your stitches aren't too tight, you should quite easily be able to knit them off. So it is really, once you get going, it's just like knitting on 2 straight needles. If you can ignore the cable and pretend it isn't there, it's just like knitting, regular knitting. And the beauty of this magic loop method is that it helps your hands quite a lot, because if, like me, I often use the short circular needle. Sorry, my stitches are a bit tight there, so just had a bit of trouble. So if you use these short circular needles, which is what I use when I start knitting in the round, you can't use them to do the magic loop method, but because of the way you hold these needles, it can be quite impactful on your hands, and so after a while you might have to stop and give your hands a bit of a shake or whatever, or a bit of a rest really. But with the magic loop method you don't get that, because it's more similar to regular knitting. And so now we've finished that second half of our stitches, you can see that we've got connected stitches. Can you see those? We've got a nice line, we haven't got any baggy stitches, got a little bit of one there, but I can probably just pull that later. Yeah, it's gone now. Sometimes you do get that. I mean, sometimes I cast on and have to cast off and cast on again because I've not quite done it right, but we're ready to do the second round now. So we knitted the first half of the stitches, and then we've knitted the second half of the stitches, and so we've knitted a complete round. Now, because we're making a toe, we need to increase our stitches on every other round. So this round now we're going to increase at the beginning and the end of each set of stitches. Okay, so we're going to knit into the front of the first stitch. So I've pulled my needle out so that I can knit. Give it a tug. Don't forget, you want to connect your cable and let it sit against this knitting needle as closely as you can. So we knit into the front, we don't take it off the needle, and then we knit into the back, and that's our increased stitch. And now we're just going to knit all the way to the end of the first half of the stitches, and it doesn't really matter where this cable sits. I often kind of loop it over my thumb, but you can move it out of the way and push it to the back of your knitting if you prefer. It's whatever makes you feel the most comfortable. And then when you get to that last stitch, we're going to knit into the front. Don't take it off the needle. Take your needle round to the back and knit into the back of the stitch so that we increase again. So now we have an extra stitch at the front and at the end of that particular needle. So we're going to turn our knitting round. We're going to push the needle back into those stitches, and then we're ready to knit the second half of this round. So we pull the bottom needle out, we put it into the first stitch. Don't forget to pull tight when you make this stitch, and we're increasing again. So we're knitting the front and we knit into the back so that we have 2 stitches now from one, and then we knit all the way along until the end. So what we're doing in terms of stitches, we're only using the knit stitch, and we're only using knit into the front and back of the stitch. So we're not using any particularly advanced techniques. It's just getting used to working with the magic loop method of knitting and that Judy's magic cast on. Now the next round, isn't going to be an increase round because we only increase on every other round. So can you see now our knitting is growing in between the two needles? So I'm going to show one more round with the magic loop method, and then I'm going to switch to my flexible trios because I just want to show you how they work as well. So this round is straight knitting, so we're going to pull the bottom needle out, pull the cable a little way along. Remember, don't pull the whole cable through, and then we're just going to knit. We're just going to knit all of the stitches, pull that first stitch really tight so that you don't get a little loose stitch at the end. And then we knit to the end. There we go. So we've knitted the first half of the stitches. We turn our work around and we either push or pull the cable. There we go. Push those back up. And then we pull the needle out. Bottom needle always comes out, and then you knit off the top stitches. Pull the yarn tightly and knit to the end. Now, I haven't put in a stitch marker yet, which is probably wise to do, but what I tend to do, to be honest, is I use my tail end of yarn. I know that when that tail end of yarn is at the front of my knitting, when I'm ready to knit, so like this, it's here, that I'm back at the end of the round. But if you want to, you can pop a stitch marker into the first stitch or the last stitch, whichever you prefer. So let's get a stitch marker. I just usually use these little bulb stitch markers for this kind of knitting. So I just pop it into one of the stitches there at the beginning so that I know that where the stitch marker is the start of the round. Okay, so it just helps me to remember. So now our knitting is growing even more. Can you see how nice that is at the front and the back? And so now I'm going to show you how to knit with these flexible trios. So it's exactly the same sort of method, it's just that we don't have that long cable. And I'm going to be honest, sometimes I get a bit fed up of pushing the needle back into the stitches, and you don't have to do that with this method. So I'm just going to knit off these stitches now onto the flexible trios. So I'm still going to pull that bottom needle out so it's out of the way, but instead of using the needle tip, I'm going to knit off onto these flexible trios so that you can see what I mean when I say about they're slightly easier to use. So yeah, just remembered I need to increase, don't I? So let's increase in that first stitch, knit into the front, knit into the back, and then knit all the way to the end. So I'm just knitting. The great thing about socks is you can just pretty much use 2 or 3 different stitches, and one of those is usually knit stitch, especially if you're just knitting a plain sock or a vanilla sock as they're often called. Knit into the front and the back of that last stitch. So now I've knitted those stitches onto my first flexible trio. So can you see I've pushed them onto that middle flexible bit? So if I just push these back stitches back onto the needle and just move that out of the way, and now I'm going to use a second flexible needle to knit into the front and back, pull tight, still pull your stitches tight at the beginning and end, just going to knit off. And can you see now I don't have any cord in the way, so that's one good thing with these flexible trios. Sorry, my needle's making a noise on the table. And then when you get to the end, we're going to knit into the front and the back of that stitch. So we've increased. So I can now take that flexible trio away, take the cable needle away, and I've got my knitting on 2 of my flexible needles, and then the third needle is the one that you always use to knit off. So you'll be taking, it's like double pointed needles, you always use a spare needle to start knitting off with, but there's only 3, so you do have to be careful that you don't lose these, because they just come in a set of 3. So I've managed so far to just have 1 set. I don't know how I've done that really. They also went in the post when everything went to the Sock Knitting Bible for photography. I had to send them away because we couldn't get any more, so that was a bit of a worry. So the best thing about these is you haven't got the long cable that you have to kind of keep pushing right back in and out, because you've only got this short cable. Your stitches are almost at the end of your needle. So I'm back at the beginning. This round is a straight round, so now I'm just going to push those bottom stitches onto the flexible cable in the middle. You see how it bends? You can just push them out of the way, and I'm just going to start knitting this round because it's just a straight round of knitting. Pull tight that first stitch, and you can either just let the needle sit there, or you can push it to the back out of the way if you want to. However it suits you is absolutely fine, but because they are flexible, they do just push out of the way. You can get rid of them from your line of knitting, which is really good. And like I say, you don't have that great big long cable. So that's half of the stitches knitted. Push them to the centre, turn around, bring them to the tip, and use the spare flexible needle to knit the second half of the stitches. Pull tight. Can you see when you pull tight how it lifts this needle closer to the one that you're using? And that just helps, like I say, to stop loose stitches. Oops, nearly dropped that one off then. Pop it back on there, knit it again. Quite hard to do tutorials because I'm actually stood up, and you don't tend to knit standing up. Your arms are not resting on anything, they're just like floating in the air. So it's not as natural as it would, you know, as you would think. But hopefully you can see what I'm doing. So I got to the end, pop them to the centre, and there we go. So we're already seeing now, can you see with these that we're getting the shape of the toe nice? Because we're increasing, the toe is increasing at the sides, and that shape is coming nicely, so that we will end up with this kind of shape, like a sloping edges for the toe. And so this has been knitted with exactly the same method, with the magic loop method and Judy's magic cast on, increasing with knit front and back at the sides, so we get a nice sort of wedge shaped toe. And then once you've reached the desired number of stitches, you just carry on then knitting for your foot until the desired length before you start on the heel. And that's how you get started with Judy's magic cast on for your toe up sock.